my friends are simps.
One of my favourite things about electronic music production is the variety of devices that are out there, which help give you a different approach to coming up with melodies and sequences, something which can drastically change the way that you write and also the output that you get. For that reason, I'm always on the lookout for interesting bits of gear, particularly sequencers, and one that has kept cropping up over the past year or so has been the T1 from Torso Electronics. I thought this looked pretty interesting, so I got in touch with Torso, who agreed to loan me a T1 to have a play about with. If I decide to keep this unit, then I believe I'll get some kind of discount. So that's the sponsorship situation, so you're aware. Now the T1 is effectively a 16-track sequencer, which you can use for rhythmical or melodic parts, as well as sequencing MIDI CC and also MIDI effects. T1 takes a slightly different approach to most other sequencers in that the focus is more on experimentation and exploration as opposed to deliberately laying down every note or drum hit. Now it does this through the use of built-in algorithms that allow you to create and vary patterns, so it's more of an organic process of composition where you embrace the happy accidents and discoveries along the way. At least that's what it's been for me anyway. Now each of the 16 pads that are on there correspond to a particular track, and each of the 18 knobs that run along the top have got 2 different functions associated with them, which you can then modify as you wish. That means that there's loads of options and potential for modulation. You access the different parameters either by twisting the knobs, by holding them down and twisting, or by double tapping and twisting. So a smorgasbord of ways to interact. Now before we dive much further into any of this, let's take a quick look at the build and the connectivity so that you know the kind of base facts of what you're going to be getting yourself into if you're interested in buying one of these. The first and most important thing to say when it comes to build and design is that this thing is as solid as a tank. The metal body gives it a real heft, and despite it being a fairly compact device, there's a reassuring weight to it. The knobs have got just the right amount of resistance, and all round, genuinely, it just feels very much like a premium bit of kit. Now there's obviously no screen, which I do kind of like, but that does come with some downsides. So for example, you can't really tell exactly what tempo you're on at a glance, which I guess doesn't really matter for composition, and you can of course slave this device to a master MIDI clock or something, but it is a bit odd. Similarly, it seems like certain configuration options can only be changed from the accompanying companion app itself. Now these aren't settings that you'll hopefully be switching out during a performance or anything like that. They're more related to whether or not T1 responds to or sends out particular MIDI messages. But I'm not a huge fan of reliance on apps like this generally, because it means you're kind of at the mercy of operating system updates, particularly on macOS, as I've discovered, and that can have a real impact on the long-term usability of a device. I would have much rather it was just as standalone as possible. Now there is obviously room within the design for firmware updates to change this, so maybe that's something that could be evolved over time, who knows. Now one element of the design of the T1 which I do really love is the fact that each of the 16 LED pads flash in time with the notes or occurrences that are being played. This not only looks really cool, but actually provides some really useful visual feedback when you're trying to figure out what individual part or track you want to edit. So that's really nice. Now in terms of connectivity, on the rear we've got a USB-C connection which is used for supplying power, MIDI data, and also accessing the aforementioned configuration utility. We've got MIDI on mini jack connections, which everybody knows is not my favourite design choice, but of course on a device that's this slim, it is an understandable one. They couldn't exactly fit full-size DIN jacks on there. However, they have also made up for it somewhat by having input, output, and a through port, which can also double up as a second MIDI output, which is quite a nice touch. Now it's worth saying that in the box I received, there was only one mini jack to DIN adapter, and the USB-C to USB-A cable was a wee bit on the short side to be used for power, so I did have to dig into my own cable box in order to make use of it in practice in the studio. Your use case may well vary, and it's not that big of a deal, but be aware of that you might have to get your own additional adapters or an extra long USB cable for power. Now in addition to MIDI, we've also got a bunch of other mini jack connections, specifically analog sync input and output, which contains dedicated reset jacks, as well as those for clock. And that's something that is essential for use with modular, at least the way that I use it. And I'm glad to see them on there because it's something that often gets overlooked by manufacturers, so nice job on that as well. In terms of CV, we've got 2 gate and 4 CV outputs, and there's even a CV modulation input. So there's loads of connectivity there, and it's cool to see analog controls in particular. Although you should note that because there are only 2 gate outputs, the number of voices you can sequence will probably be limited. And in practice, for me at least, primarily this is going to be a MIDI sequencer really, as opposed to a dedicated analog sequencer. Now finally, you've also got Ableton Link and Wi-Fi connectivity in the T1. I personally don't use Ableton, but the Wi-Fi connection is actually pretty handy for accessing the configuration options without having to plug the T1 directly into your computer. So that's pretty cool. Now when it comes to workflow, within T1 you've got 16 banks of 16 patterns, each of which are comprised of 16 tracks. And I believe, if my maths are correct, that means that you've got 256 different patterns available globally. And given the approach to composition that this device has or encourages, it's actually a pretty significant amount. Now on the face of it, each track by default can be up to 16 steps long, and that doesn't sound like a lot, but the T1 has also got this concept of cycles. So each track can be comprised of 16 cycles, which can be of different lengths and of wildly different parameter changes. So even if you just use them in a very straightforward way, that means that each track can actually be up to 256 steps long. And I definitely can't do the arithmetic there to explain all that in relation to the tracks. There's just a lot of possibilities and a lot of steps, particularly when you account for the cycles. Now there are loads and loads of different features in here that are specific to the workflow of the T1, and they could fill up a whole pile of different videos. The general idea though is that you create your sequences, provide them with different types of modulation, including randomization, send them off on their merry way, and then see how they interact and what they come up with. I'm sure that much more capable and creative people than I are doing much more clever things with the T1, but I haven't had it for a couple of months. This is how I've been using it anyway. Now the T1 is a really smart device, which has obviously had a lot of thought put into it. One feature that caught me surprised, for example, was the autosave function. This means that even if you turn off your T1 or pull out the USB cable by accident, when you turn it back on, you come back to the same state as before, which is actually pretty smart and unexpected, and something that demonstrates the amount of consideration that's gone into each of the different bits. The T1 is simultaneously a pretty deep device in terms of its functionality, but it's also actually fairly easy to jump into and just start making music with as well. You do need to put in a bit of time to learn how things work and avoid them sounding a bit samey, but you know, that's like any device worth its salt. The way that I've been using this primarily is to create patterns and play about with them, coming up with melodies and sequences that I might not normally be able to if I was to take a more deliberate, conscious approach to composition, if that makes sense. The more that I played about with the T1, the more that I realised that it was often filling the same role that I use my modular for, at least in terms of creating or coming up with unexpected sequences that meld together and evolve over time in pleasing ways. And to be honest, if I had been able to get this device 10 years ago, I could probably have saved myself a lot of financial ruin. There are a bunch of other devices out there that do similar things to the T1, including the OG Squarp Pyramid, the Squarp Hapax or Hapax, depending on how you want to call it, Polyion's Play, and also the MIDI Cake ARP. However, none of them really have the same kind of specific focus on algorithmic sequencing that the T1 does, or at least they don't implement it in the same kind of cohesive way. The burning question, of course, at this stage is, am I actually going to buy the T1? I think the answer to that has to be yeah. It's a pretty damn cool device and a great way to come up with patterns and sequences that I wouldn't otherwise, and quite a nice self-contained package, so that's my verdict for what it's worth.